The most effective form of control doesn't look like domination. It looks like intimacy, and it works by slowly separating you from your own certainty. There's a pattern in certain relationships that doesn't announce itself as control. It feels intense. It feels important. It can even feel like love, and by the time something starts to feel off, the connection already feels necessary. Necessary enough that questioning it feels riskier than trusting it. That's what makes this psychological mechanism worth understanding. Not as a label, not as an insult, but as a structure with identifiable logic, identifiable stages, and predictable effects on the person inside it. The first thing to understand is that narcissistic control is not primarily about domination. That's the misconception that makes it so hard to recognize. When most people hear the word control, they picture something overt, someone giving orders, someone raising their voice, someone visibly restricting another person's freedom. Narcissistic control rarely works that way. It works through something far more subtle, the systematic management of another person's perception of reality. The goal, and this is the core of the mechanism, is not to make someone obey. The goal is to make someone doubt their perceptions, doubt their reactions, doubt their own judgment. And in that state of doubt, naturally turn to the one person who seems to have the answers, the person engineering the doubt in the first place. This is the engine. Everything else is a variation of this. To understand why this works, you have to understand something fundamental about human psychology. Human beings are not wired to tolerate uncertainty about reality for very long. When we're unsure whether what we're perceiving is accurate, when our internal sense of what's happening conflicts with what we're being told, it creates a specific kind of psychological discomfort, cognitive dissonance. And that discomfort has a strong pull toward resolution. We want to land somewhere. We want to know what's real. And here's where the mechanism gets elegant, in a cold sort of way. If someone around you consistently, persistently offers a version of reality that contradicts your own, and does so with confidence, with emotional intensity, or with the implicit suggestion that your perception is the problem, the path of least resistance starts to look like agreement, not because you're weak, not because you're naive, but because this is how human cognition functions under sustained pressure. The brain is designed to update based on social feedback. That's not a flaw. It's how we learn to navigate shared reality together. But it becomes a vulnerability when someone figures out how to exploit that updating mechanism deliberately. This is what makes narcissistic control a psychological operation more than a behavioral one. It targets the architecture of self-trust. Let's look at how that works in practice, not through a dramatic story, but through the structure of the mechanism itself. There's a dynamic that consistently appears in these relationships. It tends to follow a recognizable sequence. First, an early phase of extraordinary attunement. The person with narcissistic patterns often begins the relationship with an unusual intensity of attention, noticing things about you, reflecting things back to you, creating a sense of being deeply seen. This is sometimes called the idealization phase. It's real in the sense that the attention is real, but it's also functional. It establishes an emotional baseline, a high point, a sense of this is what this relationship feels like at its best. That baseline becomes important later. Second, a gradual introduction of confusion, not sudden, not dramatic, small things at first. A comment that makes you question whether you remembered something correctly. A response to your emotional reaction that reframes the reaction as the problem, not whatever caused it. A pattern of your concerns being redirected back to your sensitivity, your misunderstanding, your overreaction. Third, the consolidation of dependence. Once a person's internal confidence in their own perception has been consistently undermined, something predictable happens. They start checking their reality externally. They start looking to the relationship, specifically to the person who has been destabilizing their perception, to confirm what's real. This is the pivot point. This is where the dynamic becomes self-sustaining. The person who created the doubt becomes the authority on how to resolve the doubt. If this is resonating with you, that's worth noticing. Subscribe if you want more conversations like this, and let me know in the comments what stood out to you. Now, here's where the analysis gets deeper. There's a concept in psychology called the locus of control, the degree to which a person believes that their own actions and perceptions are reliable guides to their experience. People with a strong internal locus of control trust their judgment. They feel like agents in their own life. People with a weakened or externalized locus of control look outside themselves for validation of what's real, what's good, what's appropriate. Narcissistic control at a structural level is a process of externalization. It gradually shifts a person's locus of control from internal to external, and specifically, to the person doing the shifting. This is why people inside these dynamics often describe a particular feeling that's difficult to articulate, a sense of losing the thread of themselves, not through any single dramatic event, but through a slow accumulation of moments in which their own perspective was consistently treated as suspect. And crucially, this process doesn't require malicious intent in every moment. It can operate through patterns that the person deploying them isn't always consciously aware of. That matters, not to excuse the behavior, but to understand why it doesn't always look the way people expect harm to look. There's another layer worth examining. Narcissistic control tends to be intermittent, and that intermittence is not incidental. It's load-bearing. Behavioral psychology has shown for decades that intermittent reinforcement produces stronger and more persistent behavioral patterns than consistent reinforcement. A reward that comes unpredictably creates more sustained pursuit than a reward that comes reliably. In the context of a relationship where idealization alternates with devaluation, where warmth alternates with coldness, closeness with distance, validation with criticism, the unpredictability itself becomes a psychological hook. The person inside the dynamic spends enormous cognitive and emotional energy trying to return to the baseline, trying to get back to the good version of the relationship, trying to figure out what they need to do or stop doing or become in order to stabilize the connection. This is not weakness. This is a predictable psychological response to intermittent reinforcement. The search for the pattern, what am I doing wrong, what do I need to do right, keeps the person's attention anchored entirely within the frame of the relationship. Outside perspectives recede. The relationship becomes the dominant organizing structure of their thinking. That's not a side effect of this dynamic. That is the dynamic. It's also worth looking at what narcissistic control does to language. One of the most consistent features of these dynamics is a specific kind of conversational pattern. Accountability consistently gets redirected. You raise a concern. The conversation moves to why you're raising it is the problem. You express an emotion. The conversation moves to why your emotion is an overreaction. You describe an event. The conversation introduces an alternative version of events presented with enough confidence that you begin to wonder if you remembered correctly. Over time, this creates something important. The person inside the dynamic stops bringing things up, not because they're told not to, but because they've been conditioned through repetition to anticipate that bringing things up leads to feeling worse, not better. That silence is sometimes mistaken for peace. It isn't peace. It's the absence of the energy required to try. There's a broader social dimension to this too. These dynamics often involve a process of gradual isolation, not through explicit prohibition, but through the subtle management of how outside relationships are framed. The people in a person's life who might offer alternative perspectives, who might reflect back a different version of reality, tend to get subtly positioned as problems, as not understanding the relationship, as having bad intentions, as being a source of conflict. This doesn't require dramatic intervention. It can happen through small, consistent comments, a pattern of sighing when certain people are mentioned, a recurrent implication that the relationship with this person or that person creates friction. The cumulative effect is a narrowing of the social field. And as that field narrows, the relationship with the controlling person becomes not just emotionally dominant, but informationally dominant. There's no one else offering a competing frame of reference. And without a competing frame of reference, the internal frame, the person's own sense of what's real, has very little to anchor itself to. Here's what all of this points toward. Narcissistic control is, at its core, an epistemological project. That's a slightly technical word, but the concept is simple. Epistemology is about how we know what we know, and what this dynamic targets, consistently and specifically, is a person's capacity to know what they know, not through force, through erosion. The self doesn't break dramatically. It gets slowly, quietly, methodically disconnected from its own signal. And the profound thing, the thing that explains why people often take so long to recognize what's happening, is that this process is experienced from the inside, not as control, but as love, as intensity, as the experience of being in a relationship so central, so consuming, that nothing else seems as real. That confusion between intensity and intimacy is not a mistake. It's a feature of the mechanism. Understanding this pattern changes the way you see it, not just in dramatic, identifiable cases, but in smaller versions that exist in workplaces, in friendships, in family systems. The same structural logic appears wherever someone manages another person's perception of reality rather than engaging with it honestly. The specific behaviors vary, the underlying mechanism doesn't. What you're looking for, once you understand this, is not a list of traits. You're looking for a pattern of what happens to a person's self-trust in proximity to someone else, a pattern of where accountability lands in conversations, a pattern of whose version of reality consistently prevails. That's what this explains. Not just the extreme cases, the subtle ones, the ones that don't look like control because they don't feel like control, the ones that feel from the inside like being in a relationship that somehow always requires more of you than you currently have to give. Consolidation. Here's what we actually walked through. Narcissistic control is not primarily behavioral, it's perceptual. It operates by systematically undermining a person's trust in their own experience, creating a dependence on the controlling person as the authority on what's real. The mechanism runs on doubt, specifically manufactured doubt, introduced gradually, sustained through intermittent reinforcement, and deepened through the erosion of outside perspectives. The human brain's need to resolve uncertainty, its responsiveness to social feedback, and its natural pull toward familiar sources of comfort all get recruited in service of this dynamic. Not because something went wrong with the person inside it, but because the mechanism is specifically calibrated to work with how human cognition actually functions. Isolation compounds it. Language patterns sustain it. The confusion of intensity with intimacy conceals it. And the reason this is worth understanding clearly, beyond labels, beyond drama, beyond identifying villains, is that pattern recognition is the beginning of clarity. Once you understand the structure of what you're looking at, you can see it. In large forms and in small ones, in relationships and in institutions, in the past and in real time. The self that's been quietly disconnected from its own signal doesn't come back all at once, but it does come back. And it starts with understanding what actually happened. If something in this video touched something real for you, not just intellectually, but somewhere deeper, I want you to know that's not a coincidence. This stuff lands because it's true, and recognizing truth, even when it's uncomfortable, is one of the quietest forms of courage there is. You didn't stumble onto this video by accident, and whatever brought you here, I hope you leave with a little more clarity than you came with. If you want to keep having conversations like this one, subscribe. And if something specific stayed with you, a moment, a sentence, a thought you hadn't had before, leave it in the comments. I read them, and more often than not, what one person names out loud is exactly what someone else needed to see written down. See you in the next one.